The macabre trial of a dead pope, exhuming a corpse to prosecute him. In 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered the corpse of his predecessor, Formosus, to be disinterred in order to try him for treason. Found guilty, his remains were burned and thrown into the Tiber. The tremendous surprise of the poor Roman fishermen who, according to legends, found Formosus' corpse must have been considerable. After all, it is not every day that one pulls from the Tiber the remains of a pontiff who, 9 months after his death, had been the protagonist of one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of the papacy, an episode of which the great historian Gregorovius said that it was a scene of barbarism such as no other period has ever known. To speak of Formosus and the vicissitudes of his corpse leads us to plunge headlong into the convulsive political situation of Rome at the end of the 9th century. A quick glance at the list of popes of that time shows that the Eternal City was not exactly a haven of peace. Tumultuous period. Between the years 872 and 965 no less than 24 popes succeeded one another in Rome, 9 of them in a span of just 9 years, from 896 to 904, a good number of whom were assassinated or deposed. There were pontiffs poisoned, like John VIII, imprisoned after a month in office, like Leo V, or who came to power when they were barely 18 years old, like John XII. During this time, the papacy was involved in the violent power struggles between the various ruling families of the city and, at the same time, in a wider dispute for control of the Italic peninsula, between the emperors of Germany, who throughout the 9th century set themselves up as protectors of the Church and lords of Italy, and new rising dynasties, such as the Marquises of Spoleto, who aspired to establish an independent kingdom of Italy. Formosus was deeply involved in all these conflicts. From his consecration in 866 as Bishop of Porto, a diocese located at the mouth of the Tiber, slightly north of Ostia, he carried out numerous diplomatic missions on behalf of the papacy that took him to Bulgaria, Constantinople and the Carolingian court. In those years, Formosus sided with Arnulf of Carinthia, a bastard of the Carolingian imperial dynasty who aspired to assert himself as king of Italy. This choice led Formosus to be expelled from his diocese and excommunicated by Pope John VIII, fearful that Rome would lose its independence from the empire. Thus, one night Formosus and his followers were forced to flee Rome because of the threat of a trial for corruption and immorality. Formosus found refuge at the court of Guido of Spoleto and remained for several years in northern Lombardy waiting for better times. These came with the fleeting pontificate of Marinus I, who in 883 lifted the excommunication on Formosus and reinstated him at the head of his former diocese of Porto. Under the next 2 pontiffs, the short-lived Hadrian III and Stephen V, Formosus remained quiet in his episcopal office, until in 891, on the death of Stephen, he was chosen as Pope of Rome. He was an ally of the emperor. The new pontiff had to face a poisoned political situation. Shortly before, Guido of Spoleto, after defeating a rival, had been crowned king of Italy in Pavia and then went to Rome to force Pope Stephen V to crown him emperor. Formosus had to confirm Guido's coronation and recognize Guido's son Lambert as successor to the empire. However, Pope Formosus was concerned about the dominance of the new king of Italy and immediately began secretly sending invitations to Arnulf of Carinthia, now on the Carolingian throne, to come to his aid. In 893, Arnulf made a first foray as far as Milan and Pavia. 3 years later, when Guido was dead and his son Lambert was crowned emperor in Rome, Arnulf crossed Italy and besieged Rome. Inside the city, the followers of the Spoleto rebelled and seized the Pope, who was imprisoned in the castle of Sant'Angelo. But they could do nothing against the invaders. Formosus was freed and a few days later crowned Arnulf emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. A few months later, the pontiff died at the age of 80, poisoned, it was later said. Some praised him as a just and pious pope, others, on the other hand, could not forgive him for betraying the Spoleto for the benefit of the German Arnulf. In a world as turbulent, full of intrigues and personal grudges as Rome at the end of the 9th century, history could not end like this. On the death of Formosus, the Romans elected Boniface VI, who died a fortnight later. He was succeeded by Stephen VI, a former follower of Formosus who initially recognized Emperor Arnulf, but who, as soon as the latter left Italy, aligned himself with Lambert of Spoleto. Determined to take revenge for what had happened months earlier, Lambert went to Rome, already occupied by his supporters, and there convinced the new pontiff to condemn the acts of Formosus and put an end to the aura of sanctity he had forged among his followers. The condemnation was to be public, with all the solemnity of ecclesiastical law, in front of the papal curia and everyone who had a say in the politics of the city. That Formosus was dead was not to be an obstacle, he was to be tried anyway, even if the corpse had to be removed from the grave. And that was exactly what was done. Trial of a corpse. The pantomime was prepared in every detail. Early in 897, Stephen VI and Lambert of Spoleto ordered the corpse of Formosus to be dug up and taken to the place of the trial, a synod at which cardinals, bishops, and numerous ecclesiastical dignitaries were present. Attired in all the papal insignia and dressed as he was in life, the Pope Redivivus was seated on his throne. The mock trial was so mock that a court-appointed lawyer was appointed to speak on behalf of the accused. The charges against Formoso were the least of it. It was alleged that his appointment as Pope was illegal, having acceded to the throne of St. Peter's while already Bishop of Porto, contrary to a norm of canon law that forbade moving from one bishopric to another, although there were others that seemed to authorize it. Pope Stephen's lawyer addressed the corpse in these terms: "Why, in your ambition, have you usurped the apostolic see, you who previously were only Bishop of Porto?" We do not know if the defense attorney dared to reply, but the condemnatory sentence was unappealable. The synod signed the act of deposition of Formoso, condemned him and revoked all his appointments and dispositions, to the point that the clerics who were ordained by him had to repeat the ceremony. After this they stripped him of his papal vestments and cut off the 3 fingers with which the popes imparted their blessings. After dragging the corpse through the streets of Rome, it was burned and thrown into the Tiber before a vociferous crowd. Undoubtedly, this was too much even for what the inhabitants of Rome were accustomed to at the time, and there was an immediate reaction. Stephen VI himself was imprisoned and strangled in jail just a few months later. After 2 years, John IX rehabilitated the condemned pope and forbade judging dead people, whether or not they were rescued from the Tiber by a humble fisherman. Years later, the remains of Pope Formosus were finally laid to rest in the Vatican, while the sinister story of his trial was recorded as one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Church.